I was sitting in a quiet, high-end cafe recently, watching a news segment on the overhead monitor. The UN Secretary General was on screen, his voice tight with a kind of clinical urgency as he warned of a global pushback on gender equality. He spoke of regression and backsliding, painting a picture of a world suddenly gripped by a dark, irrational desire to tear down the progress of the last century. To the pundits on screen, it looked like a political war, a deliberate choice to be reactionary. But then I looked at the table next to me. There was a young man there, impeccably dressed, scrolling through his phone with a look of profound, glassy-eyed detachment. He wasn't angry. He didn't look like a revolutionary or a traditionalist. He looked like he'd simply checked out of the world entirely. He spent 10 minutes meticulously adjusting his watch and smoothing his sleeves, totally indifferent to the civilizational crisis blaring from the television above his head. It was a striking contradiction. On the screen, the world's most powerful institutions were sounding the alarm about a backlash. But in the seat next to me was the reality. A man who wasn't pushing back, but was instead lying flat. What the UN views as a political regression is, in reality, something far more systemic and biological. It's an immune response. We are witnessing the behavioral sink of modern civilization, a phenomenon first observed in the infamous mouse utopia experiments. When the cost of participation in the social contract, the marriage, the career, the traditional roles becomes higher than the reward, the beautiful ones emerge. They are the males who stop competing, stop mating, and withdraw into a state of passive self-grooming and spiritual apathy. This isn't a temporary political shift. It's a fundamental recalibration of the human animal in a digital resource-inflated age. The alarm bells are ringing at the UN because they see the architecture of the old world crumbling. But for the individual, the question isn't how to save the system, it's how to survive the twilight of its decay. So that distinction between a deliberate political backlash and this more generalized systemic withdrawal, that feels essential.
It is. It's everything, because if we only look at it through a political lens, we completely miss the underlying mechanism. We see it as a choice, not a symptom.
Right. And that's really the mission for this deep dive, isn't it? To move beyond those political narratives and really examine the systemic, the biological, the ecological causes behind all this modern social friction and, disengagement.
Exactly. We need to find the scientific roots. Why are we seeing this profound voluntary retreat from what we used to consider a normal life?
When you say scientific roots, there's really only one place to start.
There is. The necessary foundation for this entire analysis lies squarely in the work of the ethologist John B. Calhoun. His experiments, which he conducted over decades, I think mostly at the National Institute of Mental Health, they gave us this terrifying but incredibly predictive framework for what happens to any dense population when you remove the necessity of struggle.
The behavioral sink.
The behavioral sink. That's the ecological failure you mentioned.
The name John Calhoun, it just immediately conjures up that phrase, behavioral sink. But I feel like it's so often oversimplified in popular culture. These studies, they weren't just a one-off thing, right? They ran from the late 1950s all the way through the early 1970s.
Yeah, a long time, culminating in the most famous one, the one everyone's heard of, Universe 25.
Universe 25. And to really get it, we need to understand the setup of that environment, in extensive detail. What did this so-called utopia actually look like?
Well, Calhoun's goal was nothing less than designing the perfect environment for a social mammal. He built this 9-foot square metal pen system. It was a massive habitat engineered specifically to be, and this is his term, mortality inhibiting.
Mortality inhibiting. So designed to prevent death.
As much as possible. It was a vertical system with multiple levels connected by ramps, all these different nesting boxes. It was all engineered for optimal living. But the crucial part was the resources. The mice had unlimited food, delivered automatically, unlimited water.
And the condition?
Perfect. Ideal temperature control, kept at around 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is key complete protection from all predators and any kind of disease.
So it was physically engineered to support, thousands of mice?
Yeah, the math suggested it could comfortably support somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 mice based on the physical density.
So it's not just comfortable. It's totally resource saturated. It's friction free. It's the pinnacle of material success, right?
Yeah.
It sounds a lot like a modern affluent city where all your physical needs are met by infrastructure and, delivery apps.
A perfect analogy. And so he introduced the initial population, just 8 mice, 4 breeding pairs, into this perfect world.
And what was he expecting to happen?
Well, the initial phase went exactly as you'd predict. He called it the striving phase. The mice multiplied very rapidly. They occupied the space. They established their little territories. Standard stuff. But then came the unexpected turn.
Which
The population peaked way too early. It hit about 2,200 mice, and this was only around day 315 of the experiment, well below the physical capacity of the environment.
So not even close to the 4,000 it was built for.
Not even close. And from that peak, the entire colony just entered this irreversible decline straight toward extinction.
Hold on. If the environment could support 4,000, why did the population just plateau and then collapse at just over half that number? That doesn't make sense from a resource perspective.
And that's the critical insight. This is what differentiates Calhoun's work from just, simple overcrowding studies. The collapse was not caused by scarcity. It wasn't about a lack of physical space. It was caused by intense social density.
Social density, what's the difference?
It's the psychological stress of pathological togetherness. It was the elimination of the struggle that's required to sustain meaningful social roles. In fact, in some of his earlier, smaller experiments, he found that rats, even when given more than enough space, would voluntarily cram themselves into just a fraction of the available pens, leaving the others totally empty.
So they chose to be overcrowded.
They chose it. The ultimate failure was rooted in the psychology of it all. It broke down the necessary social structure that keeps a society functioning.
Okay, so this brings us right to the core term, the behavioral sink. Can you define that for us and then maybe walk us through the specific stages of that behavioral breakdown that happened after the population peaked?
Sure. The behavioral sink is essentially the collapse in the ordered sequences of vital behavior. For a mouse, or really any social mammal, survival requires these complex practice behaviors. You have to secure a territory, you have to negotiate a hierarchy, court a mate, build a proper nest, nurse your young.
All the things that give life structure and purpose.
Precisely. And once the population hit that density peak around day 315, the environment just became saturated with social interactions. But none of them required any real effort or cooperation.
So the constant, unavoidable presence of other individuals, that became the main stressor, even if they weren't actually fighting over food or water.
Exactly right. And this led them into the second phase, what he called the plateau. And this is where the pathologies, the breakdowns, they became extreme. Social structure just dissolved.
What'd that look like?
Well, you saw hyper-aggression among males who no longer had any real resources to defend. They would fight, it seemed, just for the sake of fighting, sometimes attacking females or even pups. And at the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, you saw a huge surge in social withdrawal.
What about the females? Did their roles suffer the same kind of atrophy?
Their behavioral breakdown was maybe the most telling indicator of the entire sink. The female mice, they were just overwhelmed by the chaos. They couldn't find suitable, functioning males to mate with. They couldn't maintain a safe nesting environment. So they suffered this severe reproductive role failure.
How severe?
Some became pathologically aggressive. They'd turn on their own young, abandon them, or just constantly move them from place to place, never settling. Others simply stopped reproducing entirely. In the most disoriented groups, the infant mortality rate soared to an astonishing 96%.
96%? That's almost total reproductive failure.
It's staggering. Even the females who did manage to carry a pregnancy to term, they often failed at the most crucial step, maternal care. The learned behavior was just gone.
It sounds like the whole system was just rejecting its own future, not because of some external threat, but from a kind of internal malfunction.
That's a perfect way to put it. It was a failure of learned behavior, and the very behaviors necessary for the continuity of the species. The mice were physically immortalized, no predators, no starvation, but they were behaviorally and reproductively sterilized.
So what came next?
By day 560, they entered the decline phase. Breeding had completely stopped. The population was now exclusively made up of elderly individuals, and that led to the final phase. He called it death squared.
Death squared. I find Calhoun's conclusion on that so provocative because it really feels like it crosses the line from mythology into philosophy. He said the collapse was first a behavioral or a spiritual death, and that was followed inexorably by the biological decline.
It is provocative.
But isn't applying a term like spiritual death to mice, isn't that stretching the science a bit? How can we justify making that leap when we're trying to apply this framework to human beings?
It is anthropomorphic, you're right, there's no doubt about it, but it serves a really crucial metaphorical purpose. When Calhoun talked about spiritual death, what he meant was the loss of generative capacity. the capacity to innovate, to solve problems, to care for the next generation, and to occupy a meaningful role.
So it's about function.
It's all about function. For the mice, once the behavior that was necessary for a functioning social role disappeared, their physical existence just became meaningless noise. The body was perfectly healthy, but the functional animal was dead. In human terms, that speaks directly to existential meaning.
And the warning he left was?
The warning was that a society suffering from this kind of pathological abundance and density, it moves very quickly from a potential overpopulation problem toward an irreversible underpopulation problem, a state of functional sterility and apathy.
That makes the connection to today chillingly clear. If the collapse starts not with material suffering, but with the absence of necessary friction and meaning, we have to start looking for the human analogs.
We must. And the most compelling, the most famous pathology to emerge from all this provides the clearest analogy of all.
The beautiful ones.
The beautiful ones.
They're the ones who seem to resonate most deeply with this modern phenomenon of human withdrawal. Describe their behavior for us in detail.
These were adult male mice who just completely withdrew from the social contract. They abstained entirely from any sexual or social interaction. They refused to participate in competition, in territorial defense, anything.
So they just checked out.
Completely. They were physically healthy, plump even, and they spent their days exclusively on solitary, passive behaviors. The main one was meticulous self-grooming. They were physically immaculate, which is where the name, the beautiful ones, comes from, but they were functionally inert.
Every material need met, but no purpose.
Exactly. They had lost the functional role within their society that gave that existence any kind of purpose.
Physically immaculate, socially inert. Okay, let's connect this scientific model directly to our modern reality. This correlation between modern urban social atomization and Calhoun's behavioral sink. It feels like the essential framework for understanding why the collapse of traditional gender roles is leading to this systemic withdrawal of male participation in things like the labor and marriage markets.
It is the framework. We are witnessing a large-scale loss of what you could call role integrity, and it's happening amidst incredible material affluence. The human analogy hinges on this fact that technologically advanced urban centers, supported by massive state and corporate infrastructures, they offer the exact same paradox as Universe 25.
Endless resources, but a profound loss of purpose for the individual.
And it becomes a feedback loop, a loop of overabundance and under-meaning.
And we can see that shutdown command playing out all over the globe. You see it in Japan's hikikomori. You see it in China's tangping or lying flat movement. I was reading about this one young man in Tokyo. His name was Kenji. And his story just struck me as a perfect, almost one-to-one parallel to the beautiful ones.
Tell me about him.
Well, Kenji lives in this tiny apartment. It's barely larger than a walk-in closet, but he has all the connectivity and material goods he could ever need delivered right to his door. He's really the embodiment of this systemic shutdown command.
And Kenji's story, it puts a human face on this atrophy we're talking about. He's stopped seeking a promotion, he's stopped dating entirely, and he dedicates his time to hyper-focusing on his small, controllable environment, meticulously grooming his digital avatar online, maintaining his solitude.
And his apathy, his withdrawal, it's a rational resignation. The environment, this hyperdense urban hive, this resource-saturated world, it no longer offers him a meaningful path to what we call traditional utility, being a father, a provider, a protector.
So his resignation isn't a moral failure, it's a calculated response to his environment.
Exactly. Why would you invest all this effort into a system that seems to have zero appetite for the kind of contribution you're biologically wired to provide? The environment itself has triggered a systemic shutdown, just like it did for those mice in Universe 25.
That is role displacement theory in action. Traditional, functional roles, provision, protection, physical caregiving, maintenance, they are being displaced by the efficiency of digital ecosystems and state-supported abundance.
When you can order anything you want from Amazon or rely on state welfare as a backstop and get immediate social gratification from your phone.
The need for cooperation, for durable, real-world interdependence, it just atrophies. The social scaffolding that holds society together is effectively removed.
So the necessity of forming these stable, long-term, high-friction bonds just for mutual survival it's eliminated. And the vital functions of being a social animal, things like appreciating sacrifice, mutual aid, shared physical struggle, they just stop being practiced or expected or even rewarded by the culture.
The mice were physically relieved of necessary struggle. Humans are being relieved of necessary contribution. And without that necessary friction, vitality atrophies. The whole population starts to shift toward passivity, and this whole dynamic is being complicated and maybe even accelerated by some major cultural shifts.
Are you referring to the perspective we found in our sources that suggests certain ideological movements, specifically anti-relational feminism, might actually be accelerating these sync dynamics?
Yes. The argument presented here, it views this collapse as ecological, not purely political. It suggests that when the cultural narrative and its pursuit of individual autonomy and self-determination completely devalues or even pathologizes the very human need for intimacy, for care, for generative social roles based on some form of gendered interdependence, it actively replicates the conditions of the sync.
So by devaluing that traditional structure of contribution, you remove the structural incentive for men to even engage in the first place. If the required effort to be a functional, contributing, a protector or provider now carries this immense legal and financial risk with very little cultural or relational reward,
then the rational choice for many individuals is to withdraw that effort.
That's the core of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
The collapse isn't a backlash. It's more like an ecological audit.
Precisely. When the cultural narrative actively critiques the very characteristics that underpin traditional masculinity, it naturally reduces the male incentive to invest in those high-risk, high-effort roles. It's a mirror of the loss of purpose we saw in Universe 25. The male mice stopped defending their territories when the act itself became meaningless.
Why strive for a role that the environment has deemed obsolete, or worse, toxic?
The resulting structural breakdown, combined with that loss of meaning, it pushes a significant segment of the population toward exhaustion and, ultimately, strategic retreat. It fulfills Calhoun's prophecy of death squared.
And I don't think there's any area where this breakdown of the reciprocal contract is more acute, more algorithmic than in the modern dating and mating market.
That takes us directly into the economic and the digital dimensions of this social collapse. And historically, we have to be clear, courtship and marriage were an implicit trade contract. It was a reciprocal contract. Asymmetrical, yes, but it was based on a necessary interdependence.
Provision and protection in exchange for fertility, partnership, and building a stable community.
Right. But today, that contract is fundamentally broken. Modern ideological frameworks, state welfare systems, economic independence for women, all of these things have introduced what our sources call standard inflation in mate selection criteria.
So the physical need for a provider is gone for many women.
It is, but the biological and psychological desire for a high-status mate remains. In fact, it's hyper-amplified by exposure to infinite options online.
And this artificially elevates expectations, which effectively devalues the traditional contributions of a huge portion of men who, in previous generations would have been seen as perfectly desirable or adequate partners.
And that creates a severe sexual resource deflation for the majority of males. It pushes a very large cohort of men into exclusion from the formal mating economy, and it leads them to view the market itself as being fundamentally rigged against them.
The rigging is facilitated by technology. It removes the friction, and it just amplifies natural selectivity. This is where we need to bring in the concept of the sexual Gini coefficient. Yeah. I want to take a moment here to really walk our listeners through this because it's a bit dense, but it's absolutely crucial to understanding what's happening.
It is. So the Gini coefficient in standard economics, it's a measure of income or wealth distribution within a country. A Gini of 0 means perfect equality. Everyone has the same income. A Gini of 1 or 100 means maximum inequality. One person has all the wealth.
So when you apply that to the dating market, the sexual Gini coefficient is measuring the inequality of attention and success in finding a partner.
Exactly. We're measuring the distribution of sexual resources. So attention, matches, successful pairings, not dollars, and the digital environment, that's the accelerant.
The dating apps.
The dating apps, things like Tinder or OkCupid, they function as these massive winner-take-all resource allocators. By eliminating geographic friction and providing instantaneous high-volume choice, they create a phenomenon that massively increases that sexual Gini coefficient.
The most desirable users, the top earners of attention, they end up monopolizing the selection process.
While the majority struggle to get any response at all.
It's the elimination of necessity all over again. If I have thousands of potential options available instantly on my phone, why would I ever be mandated to form a relationship with the competent, kind, average man who just happens to be geographically close to me?
When you feel like you're holding out for the top 1% that the algorithm keeps dangling in front of you?
And the data on this, it supports this high level of inequality, right?
Oh, absolutely. This is what feeds into the widely cited, though sometimes selectively interpreted, 80-20 rule, the idea that 80% of women are competing for the attention of the top 20% of men.
This hyper-concentration of sexual resources at the very top, it leaves the majority of men just vying for drastically diminished returns.
And you have to compound that with the platform demographics. Men often outnumber women on these apps by 3 or 4 to 1. It makes the competition for the average user geometrically brutal.
So this unequal structure, it feeds directly into what our sources call institutionalized hypergamy.
Right. And hypergamy is simply the term for marrying or mating with a partner of a higher caste or status. Now, this concept is biologically grounded. It's in Triver's parental investment theory. The sex that invests more in reproduction, which is typically the female, is the more selective sex.
So the digital environment doesn't create this selectivity.
No, not at all. It just hypercharges it. It institutionalizes it. It gives natural female selectivity this unprecedented amount of data and geographical reach, which makes the choice feel absolute.
And the consequence for the majority of men is that their optimal strategy has to shift dramatically.
It has to. The high-risk, high-cost strategy of traditional pursuit. It's now met with prohibitively low returns. The rational calculator in your head just flips. And that leads directly to what we're seeing everywhere. Defensive withdrawal.
It's a quiet economic decision.
It is. Why keep investing your resources, your time, your emotional energy, your financial capital into a pursuit that statistically appears to be impossible? The result is what you could call nonviolent non-cooperation.
I read this story about a man named David in London, and he just perfectly illustrates this rational retreat. David described his experience on dating apps as a statistical impossibility. And he wasn't an outlier. He had this steady job, he was kind, responsible, but the algorithmic economy just relegated him to that bottom 80% that simply doesn't get any attention.
So he realized the old social contract was dead.
Completely. The idea that if you work hard, be a good citizen, society will reward you with a partnership. That was replaced by this brutal winner-take-all market.
And David's decision, it represents this really powerful form of economic and social protest. He rationally assessed the cost-benefit ratio of striving for traditional commitment, working endless hours to pay taxes and support a system that offers him no reciprocal reward. And he concluded it was just too high.
So he chose a quiet exit.
A quiet exit.
Yeah.
He moved to a smaller town, he cut his work hours to the bare minimum, and he functionally withdrew his labor and his tax dollars from the system.
He's not out in the streets protesting with a sign, but he's performing a kind of labor strike against the social contract. He's taking his investment out of a system he sees as making unilateral demands without offering any kind of reciprocal future in return.
And the question for society is huge. What happens when the majority of potential builders and contributors decide the game is rigged and they just walk away from the table?
Well, this systemic sense of betrayal, it then needs a framework to make sense of all the pain. And that leads directly to the codification of ideologies like the black pill.
The black pill. It provides this fatalistic, all-encompassing explanation for this intense alienation and exclusion.
Its core tenet is that society is just fundamentally stacked against low-status men because of immutable genetically determined traits, with physical attractiveness, looks, being the single key determinant for all success in life.
And this worldview is constructed by selectively interpreting science. They'll take legitimate concepts like evolutionary psychology or Triver's parental investment theory or real dating site data like the 80-20 rule, and they weaponize it. They claim this data proves that women are driven purely by hypergamy to exclusively select that top 20%, which justifies their perceived oppression.
They selectively misuse the science to reinforce a very specific hierarchy. They create this almost mythical archetype of the dominant, sexually successful male, the Chad, who they simultaneously loathe and revere.
And they position themselves as the beta males, whose struggles are immutable. It's all because of these external, unforgiving forces.
The power of the ideology is in its determinism.
That's it. If the problem is your immutable genetics or the immutable forces of female biology, then your failure isn't a personal moral failing. It's just a matter of universal fatalism. This worldview reinforces the idea that women are these amoral subjects driven purely by biological urges, and that functions as a psychological mechanism to rationalize their own pain and anger by blaming these external forces.
But underneath all that ideology and the anger and the toxic veneer, there is that core paradox that we observed in the source material.
Yes. The source material highlights this profound internal tension, the ultimate longing that's expressed by many in these online communities. It isn't just for transactional sexual access.
No.
It's for emotional validation. It's to be respected as a human. And that suggests the alienation they feel is primarily existential. It's a lack of purpose and value within the larger societal structure, with sexual exclusion just serving as the primary devastating symptom of that larger problem.
So the ideology, as toxic as it can be, it functions to provide a narrative framework. It basically says, your pain is real, you're not crazy, and none of this is your fault. It's the system, it's feminism, it's hypergamy, it's biology that is stacked against you. It rationalizes the pain that comes from the system, failing to provide those reciprocal roles.
Precisely. And if the social structure is decaying, if roles are collapsing and markets are rigged, the internal psychological cost for the individual who's trying to participate is immense. And this leads us to the final dimension of the crisis: the psychological toll and the strategic solutions that individuals are now adopting in response.
Which takes us right into the core issue of evolutionary mismatch. We're living with a Stone Age brain that is just constantly clashing with this modern, digital, hyper-efficient environment.
We carry these deep-seated instincts that were refined over millennia. Instincts for protection, for provision, for building a lasting legacy through children and community. And these traits are now colliding with a culture that, in many spaces, labels them as toxic, or at least unnecessary in this age of digital ease and state abundance.
And this cultural and environmental opposition, it guarantees a powerful biological kickback.
Absolutely. And it manifests as mental health crises, pervasive loneliness, and the sense of existential drift.
And this mismatch, it leads to a kind of profound cognitive decline. I mean, it's a direct human parallel to the behavioral sink mice who just ceased all innovation and problem solving. We are witnessing an atrophy of what our sources call conceptual space.
Conceptual space, that psychological arena where moral imagination and long-term planning and generative agency actually reside.
And the environment is actively crowding out the necessary friction that's required for thought.
It is. Algorithmic entertainment, increasingly prescriptive, curated environments, they aggressively displace unstructured thought, independent problem solving, and the generative arts. The individual is being turned into a passive spectator of their own life, just consuming curated content instead of engaging in generative cognition.
Just think about it for a second. Our ability to form complex dreams, or to negotiate contradictory values, or even to plan the logistics of a long-term, high-friction relationship, all of that diminishes when the immediate low-friction dopamine hits are constantly available on your phone.
The friction of thought, which is what strengthens the mind, is being short-circuited.
And this atrophy is now being exponentially accelerated by generative AI.
A huge accelerant. AI automates vast amounts of mental effort. It curates our decisions, it generates ideas, it eliminates the need for that tedious process of research and synthesis. This cognitive outsourcing, it risks eroding what psychologists call the strength model of self-control.
Explain that.
It's the psychological concept that mental stamina and moral resilience have to be exercised, just like a muscle, to remain robust.
And if an AI can instantly write the complex email, or generate the brilliant idea for the meeting, or even offer the perfectly phrased moral or emotional response,
the necessity of effortful thought is removed. The essential developmental processes, the questioning, the synthesizing, the struggle, and even the failure that's required to build a resilient self, they are being bypassed entirely.
Efficiency is preserved, but agency is extinguished. We risk confusing instant fluency with genuine understanding and passive consumption with generative cognition.
And that is the ultimate danger of digital affluence. You maximize convenience while creating the conditions for Calhoun's model of maximal passivity and loss of purpose.
So when the system fails to provide purpose, and your internal wiring is getting frayed by this evolutionary mismatch, the only viable option left for a resilient individual is a kind of strategic retreat. I was reading the account of a software engineer named Marcus, and his story just captures this necessary yet very solitary adaptation to this new reality.
What was his story?
Well, Marcus spent years trying to navigate what he called the algorithmic social engineering of modern gender politics and career demands. He felt that constant clash, his deep-seated biological wiring for protection and legacy versus a culture that was penalizing those very traits. And his reaction was a strategic, high-level withdrawal.
He stopped looking for validation from the system.
Completely. He stopped trying to fix it and turned instead to ancient Stoic survival strategies, focusing entirely on psychological sovereignty. He now treats the post-reciprocity world not as a society he is obligated to fix, but as a natural disaster he must survive.
His goal is anti-fragility, the ability to not just withstand disorder, but to actually gain from it.
Exactly. And this strategic retreat, it demands building these robust internal and external systems. Radical financial independence, relentless physical health, and these tight-knit, non-ideological communities. He just refuses to sign unequal contracts, whether they're economic or relational, that impose high costs for diminishing or even negative returns.
Marcus's story, it highlights a profound but very solitary kind of resilience.
It is. He practices voluntary hardship, he minimizes his digital footprint, and he finds peace in the realization that he can't change the larger backlash, only his response to it. Is the strategy of the sovereign individual, a man who survives the system by becoming invisible to its demands.
It's admirable for sure, but it also underscores the immense societal cost of all this. When the bridge between the sexes has been burned by ideological friction and the collapse of reciprocal roles, solitary resilience becomes the necessary yet incredibly lonely survival strategy.
The structural scaffolding for partnership and community is just gone, forcing the individual to retreat into this inner kingdom of one.
Which brings us back around to our synthesis. The UN's concern about regression and backsliding. In our analysis, it isn't a moral lapse or a political choice. It's natural law performing a corrective audit on unsustainable social engineering.
The profound systemic withdrawal of men from the labor force, from marriage, the digital hyperpolarization of attention, the rising isolation, they're all interconnected ecological responses to the loss of meaningful reciprocal roles.
They are not pushing back, they are opting out.
And the true danger, the ultimate lesson from the behavioral sink, is that paradox of collapse. It stems not from the suffering of scarcity, but from the void that's created when necessary friction, struggle, and durable interdependence are systematically removed from our lives.
We're experiencing the atrophy of vitality that Calhoun predicted all those decades ago. The insight from the beautiful ones is crystal clear. Death begins not with starvation, but with the absence of necessity.
You are not obligated to save a world in its twilight, but you are obligated to reclaim your sovereignty from the crumbling architecture of a failing experiment. Ensure you are not among the beautiful ones, passively grooming themselves as the lights go out. Cultural renewal demands the rediscovery of generative action and purpose.